Hey, this is Michael Lindsay from Vital MX. We're out here in Crawfordsville, Indiana at Ironman Raceway, one of the locations that hosts a round of the AMA Pro Motocross Championship. Honda brought us out here for the 2025 CRF450R launch. As you can see, it is pouring rain. We were able to squeak in some very early morning riding this morning on good conditions. Before the rain came in, we did a little bit of slop testing, and now it is in straight downpour. We were able to get all of our testing time in, but because of that, we have sacrificed my ability to be dry while talking. So we're gonna cut to a little studio footage where I can speak a little bit more comfortably. See, now that's a little bit nicer. So if you checked out our first impressions on the new CRF450R that came out about a month ago, a lot of what I'm about to say is going to sound very familiar and maybe a little cliche. Again, this bike is not revolutionary. It is evolutionary. And this is something that isn't that common for Honda. It's a little bit more common for some of their competitors. And as of late, it's a trend we've seen with pretty much every OEM. These bikes have all gone very good. Very, very good, in fact. So it's pretty hard to reinvent the wheel. Instead of trying to swing for an all-new platform, a new design every time, it would probably be a little bit better to just take the negative points of your existing platform and just try to improve upon them. Again, that's something that Honda hasn't always done. Take their past CRF450Rs. Really, back in the day, the 02 to 05 was kind of an evolutionary bike. But then from there on, your 09, your 13, your 17, even your 21, those were big jumps on the bike. They were very different every time they came out. They were a different design structure. And as they admitted, they would basically go into these new platforms. The design team would have a target goal, whether it was the power, the turning of the bike, the weight of the bike. There was something that was a main target where the bike's design was built around and then expanded from there. Finally, they've looked at it as like, okay, we have positives in our existing platform. We need to just figure out how to work on the negatives. So this bike, yes, resembles their 21 bike extremely closely because it is basically almost like a 21 just evolved. And starting with that, it comes down to the chassis. First off, 70% of the chassis is different. And that's pretty much from a weld-to-weld point. You can see it being unchanged. So the welds that are unchanged are from the front motor mounts down through the cradle to right before the foot peg region. That section of the frame is unchanged. And then the two main spars you see on the bike, from the weld point at the mid part of the frame up to right before the head tube, that section is unchanged. The rest of the frame is changed. Geometry wise, it all looks pretty identical, albeit the new frame is 0.2 of a degree more relaxed on the steering tube angle. So a little bit more relaxed, a little bit calmer on the input, which comes down to the whole theme of this chassis being calmer, being more predictable. The sections of the frame they've changed. They are all stiffer. And yes, makes you scratch your head at first when you hear that, because us in media, even guys on the race team, everybody have been saying for years now, the Honda's too stiff, it's very rigid. In fact, Trey Kennard came up, test driver for Honda himself. He said that was his impression, even testing the Honda and working with them, is our chassis is too stiff. In fact, though, they basically commented that they took their chassis and they took everybody else's frame, put it on jigs and dynos and twisted it and dropped it and put force into it. And they're like, okay, exact opposite. We're actually really, really soft. We might be too soft because we're starting to think that the bike is binding, that the frame is like acting like a spring. It's storing energy, it's compressing, and it finally has to go somewhere, creating this unpredictability that people felt like the Honda has, where it doesn't feel like it maybe does the same thing twice, or you can't account for how it's always going to react in a situation. So even Trey said, they go out to the test track, they get a frame with a bunch of gussets and all these welds on it, similar to what we've seen the race frames with the Lawrences and Chase Sexton when he was there look like. And he said, you ride it and it's, very different. And that's the impression we end up finding on track. Same as with the 250 intro. Again, it's pretty obvious within a first couple corners, even when the track's not, almost even when the track's not rough, when it is smooth and you can just accelerate hard, you can brake hard, you can load the bike. It just feels calmer. The input feels slower. It doesn't feel as reactive. In a small sense, yes, it feels stiffer because as the track develops from smooth into its first bit of chop, the really small stuttery stuff, you feel, okay, this new bike isn't quite as plush through the frame. It does feel like you feel the ground more, but it's a very calm and planted feel. And I wouldn't call it harsh or anything like that. I'm not riding it thinking, oh, it's beating me up or anything, but you just feel it be a little bit stiffer in these places and not bind as much. But where it starts to shine is you input a lot of speed into the bike, you input a lot of lean angle and load, or you again start to input braking bumps, acceleration bumps, big landings, things of that nature, anything that's applying force to the bike, and suddenly everything just feels mellower compared to the old machine. And one of the easiest things I could say is the forgiving aspect is, and part of where I think people can like comment that the old bike feels forgiving. Us as riders, yeah, we want to feel like we're doing the same thing every time, exactly the same. But I mean, let's be honest, our weight's a couple, you're a little farther forward sometimes under braking the next lap, a little farther backwards, used a little more brake, used a little more throttle on exit or a little less. It happens. Like as much as we think we're doing everything identical, we're not. That's where the old bike was less forgiving. It's every change in input affected the chassis and how the bike would react a lot, to the point where things would feel unpredictable because you'd be like, one lap, hey, I did this. The next lap, I think I did the same thing, and the bike did not respond the same. This bike is more consistent with inputs. You can be a little bit off as a rider, and it doesn't change how much the bike reacts. So in a term there, I would say like the new chassis is the new bike as a whole is very forgiving. Again, huge part of that comes from the chassis, the being stiffer and the being calmer because of that. Because now, as they say, it has the right amount of rigidity, in their opinion, in the right places by making it stiffer from that shock tower down through the foot pegs, changing the subframe location, changing the force and basically where the energy is put into the subframe, kind of closer to the shock tower point where the bike is stiffer, and then changing again that head tube area where I don't feel like the head tube is flexing under braking, so the front end doesn't feel like it's wandering. And that's a huge thing for me, is under really heavy braking. It wasn't as much, a lot of people say the Honda was twitchy, and yes, it could be in situations, but for me, under heavy braking, if you're looking at a line, I felt like the old bike would wander a little bit, like it would twist under braking. The front would just kind of move over in a sense. It would flex enough. It would be a little bit harder to keep it right on the entry line that you wanted. And the new bike is so much better there, especially again, lean angle. The old bike to me is very much stand up, really late in the corner, stand, then drop it in last minute, make a very aggressive lean angle move at the last minute. That's how the old bike seemed to respond better. It didn't respond as well in lean angle because it would bind up and step out and miss corner entry. So the new bike is so much calmer. It's easier to actuate lean angle early into the corner. And on the 450, that's even more noticeable than the 250. Because I mean, beyond 450's got a lot more inertia behind it because of the engine. And then speaking of the engine, similar to 250, this thing is mechanically the same as the outgoing bike, but the power is dramatically different. On the 250 we rode, they got more out of it because of the ECU, the airbox, and the exhaust system changes. We basically have the same list of changes on the 450, but for different reasons. We have an airbox, air boot velocity stack change, we have a head pipe change, and we have a lot of mapping changes here. And they've really calmed down the 450. Nobody really jumps on CRF450R and says, man, this bike doesn't have enough power. It's got plenty of power, and it came on in a very aggressive nature. The amount of work they've done with the ECU on the side after implementing the new airbox and pipe, we were talking to them, a lot of it came down to some of the testing with like Kennard and Berner, who had rode the work spikes, the ones they had built for Geyser, not even that, but like the Lawrences, this very linear, long drawn out power that those guys like, even in their race package, is extremely usable for everybody. So being able to relay the difference on how the factory bike was working, bringing that to production, trying to figure out how to get the mapping in ECU on the production bike to work as similar to the factory bike as possible. So yes, that power is now very linear. It's very smooth. I would say it's very like Austrian-esque, similar to the new Cowie 450, except with more output. The Honda's got plenty of output, but they've definitely tamed it down and reeled it in. Two big standout is you don't have this big surge from low to mid that would basically wear you out and pull you off the bike and make the bike teeter-totter. Again, playing into some of the chassis, but even the way the power would make it is the old bike would pitch a lot from front to rear because of power, because of balance of the bike. Braking, it would dive, throttle, it would squat, and you're always trying to get the bike stiffer and to ride more level. The new bike does that because of the chassis and the power. The power, because that acts more spread out, second feels very long, third feels very long. However, it is still the old engine. There's two things that stood out to me. I would say, yes, overall, 90% of the power change is positive. There are people that rode the Hondas that liked that aggressive punch. You may miss it. If you really like that big hit feel, that's not there on this bike. And they've changed the mapping so dramatically, and the air box and the pipe and everything. Like, what one thing it does show is how much you can do with ECUs. Yes, you could take an aftermarket ECU, have it specifically tuned. You could probably get a good chunk of it back. Part of it's in the air box again, and part of it's in the pipe. It's going to miss some of that big hit. You could get some of it back, but it's going to be a much mellower feel on this bike. Also, because you can basically make it pull longer in the gear, the Honda 450 definitely has a decent chunk of inertia as an engine. It's maybe not as free feeling as the Cowie or the Yamaha at times under engine braking, or doesn't have as free of engine braking feel. So because you can pull it so much longer, I did catch myself a couple times just trying to rev out second from tight section to tight section to see what would happen. And if you very quickly chop the throttle, you did feel a bit of that inertia built up in the Honda 450. And that also comes into the other maybe negative on the new bike. While I'm talking about how much better it's balanced, how much calmer it is on inputs and everything, talking a bit how the power and chassis have played into how the bike squats, what the bike balance is, touch on the suspension a little bit. This is the one area of the bike when I wrote it at this intro where I was like, okay, this was a bit of a, I don't want to say miss because it was more positive than the old bike, but it stood out as the thing that still needed the most improvement. And that was the front fork. They have gone rid of a lot of their kind of step harsh character out of it. And a lot of that came down to stiffening the lower triple clamp, the upper fork tubes, going into the stuff that was done to the frame, the axle lugs, the axle, again, everything they decided there was just moving too much and allowing the fork to bind to basically feel harsh, because as it would compress certain, like an axle twisting, lower tubes, the upper tubes basically bowing, things of that nature were all creating friction and binding in weird places and weren't allowing the fork to just move. By stiffening a lot of those components, now the fork is just able to move through the stroke easier in a sense. There isn't so many other motions being applied to it, if that makes sense. So the fork is more comfortable and it is softer. They've gone to a softer pressure spring setting. They have preloaded it more. They've actually changed their seals to create more friction because they made, I think, the fork move so much. They were trying to catch up with some of that by actually having seals that hold the tubes more. And then the actual main setting itself has changed. Fork springs are the same. It is very comfortable. Initial touch feel is fantastic on this fork, especially for a Showa and on a Honda, because that's seems to be something they've been missing for a long time. But it is still soft. Particularly the track we rode at, Ironman does have some bigger jumps. They kind of have a lack of landing, some bigger braking sections. Overall, for your target 450 weight, I'm in the high 180s right now. Most guys are going to be on a 450. People even heavier than me. Yeah, people higher than me. It's just a little bit soft. I end up going 3 or 4 clicks stiffer. That fork is pretty sensitive to change though. I end up pushing my forks out a little bit, taking a little more sag off the bike. The fork stance starts at 5 mil for fork height. I end up going to 3. We also went the sag. We went from 105 to like 106, 107 just to get some weight off the front because the fork would transfer weight. Under braking, it would transfer still a little bit too quick. It's weird. The old bike would teeter-totter both ways. The new bike is much calmer, but because of the fork, it does dive a little bit. And then the other thing I said is depending on the power, if you start, because the power feels mellower, you start really pulling it through the power. As I said, if I just wrung it out in second, I would catch myself chopping the throttle really hard in second with a lot of energy and a lot of inertia bound up in the engine. And then that fork would dive a little bit and the engine would pull it down. So it would very quickly transfer the weight. So some of the changes I was doing was to eliminate that. But then the bike being that little bit soft on the front end, on some of the bigger G-out landings, it would kind of blow all the way through and then come back up and sort of lose contact with the ground, just lose a little bit of control. So not as confidence inspiring as the rest of the bike. However, seems like a fairly simple fix. Like I immediately, when we get back to California, I want to slap either a stiffer spring rate on one side, go 5.2 on one side, so go to like a 5.1 split rate, or add some oil to the fork, potentially both, just to try to get a little bit more speed sensitivity out of it. Now I'm really impressed as the shock went, I believe, from a 5.6 to a 5.2 spring rate, because they changed the linkage dramatically. Somehow though, the shock is has so much better initial comfort than the old shock, but has still better ramp up at the end, because the linkage, I guess you would say, basically doesn't have as much leverage towards the end of the stroke. Iron Man's famous for the big Godzilla jump up and then the big step down where you land on the downhill. You can go wide open down that hill in third or fourth and it G's out to the bottom. A couple times I just sat through it just to see if I could get the shock to go all the way through, and it has great control at the end of the stroke. I could never really get to G out and get the bike to respond from the rear, never get the rear to sort of unload. Not enough steep jumps to try seat bouncing stuff, but overall the shock outperformed the fork, in my opinion, on this bike. And again, the shock, the chassis, and the engine all fall into the same category. They are calmer, they are more forgiving, and they make the bike more confidence inspiring to ride because they are easier in a sense. Now, a couple of standouts. Again, the bike really, again, isn't that much change. You start looking at the bike and it basically looks like the old bike minus some changes to the plastic and the subframe mounting and a couple things like that. And it's funny because on one hand, I can talk about the chassis, like it is a big change the way they overhauled it, but it is, again, just an evolutionary step of their old bike. Plastic-wise, the only thing that's really different is the side plates and the radiator shrouds. The radiator shrouds are hit or miss for some people in terms of looks. They do perform better than the older ones. You don't get hung up on the hooks as much at the end. The shape of them and where they're tapered just seems to offer a little better grip. The back half of the bike is where it's very noticeable. It's almost like having a twin pipe bike again, because on the left side, your airbox side that has no pipe, they basically built a spacer in underneath that holds the side plate out about the same amount it has to taper for the exhaust. So you have kind of a built-in point for your legs, the back of your boots and the back of your calves to sort of slide in, hook into. And as you can see, they've textured that area of the side plates a lot to give you something to grip on. The old Honda is almost a little skinny feeling in the center, and you can kind of lose, you know, a contact point. And that's where we've seen like the Lawrences do the big carbon wings coming off the back of the frame and a lot of grip tape to try to give grip points on the motorcycle. The new bike way more naturally has that. And for being a minor plastic change, it's by far one of the biggest feeling I've ever felt as a rider for how you contact the motorcycle. That's super appreciated in terms of how much easier it means to be on the bike. Combine that again with the bike being more balanced, less teetery, combine it with the power, it makes this one, makes it where the old bike is, you know, if you're not riding a lot, you're non-shape, the old Honda is a 3 or 4 lap bike and you're just hanging on for dear life, where the new bike gives you the confidence, like, okay, I may have not been riding a lot lately, but I can put in time on this bike and not slip off. You don't feel like you get as in trouble. And that actually even comes down to another note on the power, is almost like the bike not being able to get away from you is easy. Again, the power is so calm. The Honda reminds me a bit of the new Cowie, where I can actually go to 100% throttle position, which I know it's 450, that sounds weird, but you know, you ride like the Yamaha and you're kind of fiddling with the throttle between 40 and 75%. It's very hard on the Yamaha unless you're going up a hill or a big open straight to ever truly get to 100% throttle position. The Honda, you can get there and you feel very in control of the bike. You're able to get a lot out of the motorcycle, which brings a lot of fun factor into play when you feel like you're more in control of the bike than it is than, you know, the bike being in control of you. So overall thoughts on the bike. Yes, I did this for the 250 intro. I was able to ride the old bike to the new bike back to back. Being all the way in Indiana, I wasn't able to bring one, but just based off my impression, like it is on paper, it may seem like a minor change, but I absolutely would not ride the old bike over this, hands down. The only thing that the old bike wins out on for me is a little bit on corner entry. The old bike being softer chassis, it would load the front more slightly in on the head angle. Yes, the old bike outturns this new one slightly on real tight corner entry, but it's worse 90%. The old bike is worse 90 through the other 90% of the corner, basically. The only other aspect is the old bike had grunt. It had Nudge Grunt more of that hit exciting character, which some people again might miss, but everything else on the new bike is an absolute positive, and I still think, of course, the power change again is better for 95% of the people who are going to ride this. When you even have, again, they kept repeating it, but I heard Hunter say it, like, hey, we've rode the old stock bike, and even, you know, Hunter and Jet don't like the power. They're both like, even for us, the stock bike isn't very rideable, the old stock bike. The new one is so based off of the power characteristic they've gone for with their racing platform. So overall, what does this all wrap up to? It's, again, a bike that is calmer. This is everything from, you know, how it is at high speed, how it is on corner entry, how it is on corner exit, how it reacts to coming up short, coming up long. The bike is calmer. It reacts more consistently. It's more forgiving for a rider that makes mistakes, which the vast majority of us do. Between the power, the chassis, and suspension, if you are off on your body positioning, if you accidentally grab a handful, if you're getting tired at the end of a moto, this bike is overall more forgiving in every aspect. The only, like I said, the only thing for me that still is an improvement point right out of the box is a bit of the balance because of the front fork, but it's not miles off. It's the direction is there, and I feel like it's pretty easy to obtain. Anyways, a decent amount to say again about a bike that on paper has not actually changed that much, but on track has affected the platform in ways I would have never personally imagined. I say that after riding the 250, I kind of knew what we were getting into, but it is, again, even more noticeable from the chassis point of the 450, because it's all, the old 250 didn't react as bad again. The lesser power of the 250 and the lesser inertia, it doesn't affect the chassis as much. You get on the 450 and the chassis shines even more. Those chassis updates shine even more on this platform, and their ability to manipulate the power just between the airbox, the ECU, and the pipe is absolutely astonishing. And again, really kicks back to me that pretty much you can take any modern 450, and with pipe, fuel, and an aftermarket ECU and a good tuner, you can really shift the power any which way you want to make yourself pretty darn happy. If you have any questions on our thoughts on our first impressions of this bike, again, we tested it in Ironman. We got about 3 hours in before it started pouring rain. We should have the bikes back in California in the next 2 weeks to do further testing on. If you have any thoughts, we're going to do kind of a, not a redo, but definitely a little bit of another test once we get it back here. If there's things that you're curious about, you want answered, please throw them in the comment section below. If I can answer them now, I will. If they're not, I will keep them in mind for the California test when we get that motorcycle back out here on the West Coast. As always, if you like this content, thanks for watching, subscribe, and see you later.